stress to the head. I'm trying to do more for the soul, way less for the bread. Yes, sir. I take pack to the lung, kill the stress to the head. I see the things that they do way less than they say. Cause it's a war on the real, baby, look outside. A war on the real, baby, look out. Cause it's a war on the real, baby, look outside. A war on the real, baby, look out. Cause it's a war on the real, baby, look outside. A war on the real, baby, look out. Cause it's a war on the real, baby, look outside. A war on the real, baby, look out. Can't be a real, might get you canceled. The whole system need to dismantle. Coppers treated like the utmost wanted. Trying to rule the block but don't know what goes on it. News got a story with a new take on me. Carrying out the window with the screw face on me. But I know that God love me when my burn 95 degrees and I can't get sunburn. Wonder when your government don't make me legal. Burn the whole city if I can't be equal. Get off my please, Brad, I earned that. 400 years, how you still ain't learned that? I take pack to the lung, kill the stress to the head. I'm trying to do more for the soul, way less for the bread. Yes, sir. I take pack to the lung, kill the stress to the head. I see the things that they do way less than they say. Cause it's a war on the real, baby, look outside. A war on the real, baby, look out. Cause it's a war on the real, baby, look outside. A war on the real, baby, look out. Cause it's a war on the real, baby, look outside. A war on the real, baby, look out. Cause it's a war on.
All right, welcome to Paradigm Shift TV 314. This is your brother, DMG the Poet, aka Brother Pianki. And we are in the building. We got a great debate for you all between Garfield the Great, leader of the Dagger Squad, host of the Brother Garfield podcast. And we got our brother, the Slim Reaper, Mr. Logic himself, Leandre Williams McBride. And we're going to get this in. The question is, did Abraham exist? Before we get to the brothers, let me do my usual spiel. Let me say hotep to my Kemetic brothers and sisters. Let me say shalom to my Israelite brothers and sisters. Let me say God bless to my Christian brothers and sisters. Let me say Islam to my Moorish brothers and sisters. Let me say assalamu alaikum to my brothers and sisters in the NOI. Let me say peace to my brothers and sisters in the nation of gods and earth, them 5%ers. Let me say what's up to my atheist brothers and sisters. Let me say what's up to all my Abo brothers and sisters. And finally, let me say Jumbo to the rest of my brothers and sisters throughout the African diaspora, be it here in the wilderness of the United States of America or beyond. Y'all know I say that greeting for one reason and one reason only. It's because if you black, I'm with you, and I hope you with me. Our different ideologies should not keep us from uniting, and we can disagree without being disrespectfully disagreeable, and we can have unity without uniformity. With that being said, my brother Leandre, it's on you. Let's get this in. Did Abraham exist?
All right, it's my time.
The time is 15 minutes. It'll start when you start.
All right, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right. So my name is Leandre McBride. And the entire reason I took this debate was that a few months back, I was hosting a live with Brother Garfield, and he made a statement that I thought was amazingly ridiculous and illogical related to the historicity of Abraham. As someone who's been trained in logical methodology, my ears perked up as I heard Garfield make an illogical argument from ignorance related to the existence of the biblical figure Abraham. And that's why I'm here today. As a matter of fact, hang on, Pete, can you, I need to share my screen. Can you?
Yep.
Here we go. All right, it's up. Let me know.
You should be good.
Okay. So here, this is going to be the flow of my.
Hold on. Is it 5?
Remember, he said his opening was part of his presentation.
We both got to introduce ourselves.
Oh, you wanted to do yours along with? I got you.
Okay. Well, that's fine. I'm happy to pause here and let Garfield do his, and then I can continue after.
Yeah, I got your time stop.
Okay.
I mean, Garfield the Great needs no introduction, but my apologies. Go ahead, bro.
Garfield, it's on you. Can y'all hear me? What's going on? It's supposed to be Garfield's turn, right?
Yeah. Garfield, it's on you, bro. My apologies. I thought we was jumping right into his presentation.
Hold on. He got to introduce himself to the audience. Then I got to introduce myself. It's a 5-minute intro, and then after that, you do your 15 minutes.
Okay. My intro's done. You can take over now.
Yeah, that's what we were saying. His intro is complete. We gonna let you do yours.
All right. Let me. Let me shift. My computer just wilding out right now. 1 second.
Hey man, that's the God of Abraham, man. And while our brother fight with the God of Abraham over his computer, I just want to say thank you to the brothers for coming on the channel, particularly the brother Garfield, who has one of the biggest stages in our community, gracing my platform, Leandre, who is studying multiple fields, getting multiple degrees, taking time out of his schedule. So salute to both of these brothers and salute to everybody in the chat.
All right. Are you ready?
Yes, sir.
All right. You can make it bigger on the screen, by the way, too. All right. What I'm going to do is, you know what? Let me do this. All right. You could go. Ready?
Oh, you good, Garfield? Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. So did Abraham exist? So today I'm debating the brother Leandre. I want to say thank you for taking up this debate and calling me out, and brother DMG. So the purpose of Abraham exists is this. We're trying to establish if this person who is called Abraham in the biblical text exists. So what we're going to boil down to, family, is several things. It's going to be boiled down to a methodology, but I'm not going to get into a methodology yet. What I'm going to say to you guys is there's several arguments in academia regarding Abraham. And the consensus, right, I'll deal with that in a second. But pretty much some of the arguments when you're looking at something regarding Abraham is you have to look at all sides universally. All right. So what I did was I basically checked out Comparative Customs and the Patriarchal Age by Martin J. Selman. And he basically broke down one of the main arguments regarding Abraham's historicity. Right. One of the main arguments is going to be different type of traditions and customs in the ancient Near East around the time when Abraham existed or around the time in the ancient Near East period. So you're going to have mentions of birthright and eldest son. You're going to find records of that in the ancient Near East. You're going to find inheritance and property, stuff you see in the Old Testament. You're going to find adoption of slaves and adoption by grandfather, certain things that you're going to find in the biblical text. Not exactly word for word, but you're going to get a sense of this. You're going to get bearing upon knees, which is a custom in the ancient Near East, including Homeric Greece, Old Germany, and so forth. You're going to hear about female slaves and dowry. You're going to hear about having a second wife, arranged marriage, and adultery. You're also going to hear about rituals and marriage contracts. Why did I bring this up from the beginning? Because these things is what this debate is going to be boiled down to. But this, even if he shows these things, it doesn't prove Abraham existed. We are looking for Abraham, not for common or comparative stuff. Another name that you're going to hear a lot of is a guy by the name of Chedorlaomer. When we talk about the Genesis 14 kings, you're going to hear that if he's historical or not. There's no consensus on this. In fact, there's no proof that this person even existed. Then you're going to hear about Amraphel, which is what pissed him off when we had the conversation. because these people are not historical. What people who believe the Bible try to do is try to find someone who agrees with them, and then they'll say, hey, you see, this proves that Abraham exists. No, even if Amraphel or Chedorlaomer exists, it doesn't prove Abraham existed. And let me just quote this before I stop talking. The book of Genesis, composing, reception, and interpretation. Biblical scholars have long sought to identify authentic historical memories from the pre-Israelite period, prior to the Israelite settlement of 1200 BC within the narratives of Genesis. But the plausible results are very meager. The optimism of William Albright's generation that archaeology could pinpoint the historical context of particular Genesis stories in a particular patriarchal period turns out to have been misplaced. Textual and archaeological evidence from Mari, Nuzi, and other second millennium sites were interpreted very loosely to yield correspondences with Genesis, or were taken as local customs when in fact they represented widespread Near Eastern norms that lasted for a millennium or more. The current consensus is that there is little or no historical memory of pre-Israelite events or circumstances in Genesis. So we could say, hey, you know what? We're going to do this and prove this and that. All you got to do, my brother Leandre, is show us Abraham. I don't care about no customs. I don't care about opinions. I want to see Abraham, and you're going to do something that no scholar has been able to do in the history of archaeology, history, anthropology, and whatever. You got to prove Abraham exists. So my research methodology is this. We are carrying out research with primary sources, archaeology, anthropology, etc. We're going to collect the information, basically all the information, and decide which information should be gathered from who and why. We're going to propose and put forward books, articles, and journals, and the steps that were taken to collect the information. And then after that, we're going to analyze it. But before we do none of that, the thing that we got to ask, the research question is, did Abraham exist? And I would love my brother to prove that. All right, that's it right here, brother.
All right. So that was Brother Garfield opening. He came throwing daggers. And I apologize, family. I had misunderstood how we were going to open this thing up. That is on me, not on the brothers. Brother Leandre, you ready to get back started?
Yes, indeed.
All right. And your time had left off at 14 minutes and 15 seconds. Are you good with that?
Yep, that's perfectly fine with me.
All right. Time will start back when you start.
So now what we're going to get into the flow of the argumentation. So I'm going to go over the burdens that each of us has to prove. Contrary to what Garfield said, I not only have to prove or give evidence that would lead to the conclusion that Abraham existed, but Garfield, in an actual debate, actually has to give positive evidence for believing that Abraham did not exist. And so we're going to go over some of that and why I thought the reasoning was fallacious in the first place. So the burdens that we both have before us here is that as the person, me, making the affirmative argument, this is my task of evidence that leads to a conclusion with reasonable accuracy. My opponent has to do the exact opposite. He has to show that Abraham did not exist, which is a near impossible task, according to Richard Carey, who he's had on the show. And where Richard Carey, there's a quote there, says, negative statements often make claims that are hard to prove because they make predictions about things which are in practice unable to observe in a finite time. For instance, there are no big green Martian means there are no big green Martians in this or any universe. And unlike your bathtub, it is not possible in every corner of the universe to look in every corner of the universe. Thus, we cannot completely test this proposition. We can just look around within the limits of our ability and our desire to expend time and resources on looking and prove that where we have looked so far and within the limits of our knowing anything at all, there are no big green Martians. In such a case, we have proved a negative, just not the negative of the sweeping proposition in question. So we are both tasked with providing positive evidence to establish our claims, appeals to ignorance, which you've heard Garfield do are fallacious, and this should be avoided by the opponent. There should be a consistent historiography followed by both people to establish the methods we are employing are not arbitrary, which would be the fallacy of special pleading. So the method here. So I will not need to appeal to anything supernatural. Most of the stuff that Garfield said I'm going to need to appeal to, you won't even hear here. I will assume for the sake of argument something other than Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. I will display a continuity of historical thought. I will demonstrate that my position has scholarly support, and I will then conclude. So what is Garfield's his objection to Abraham? And so I've transcribed the text here, and here's video. So just take a second and listen to what his objection was and what got under my skin.
Go into genetics, linguistics, history, anthropology, and archaeology. And what's going to come out of that is going to be a lot of controversy about who fits this, who fits that. But people don't understand the biblical text. The biblical text was written at a time period. It wasn't written as one book. You're talking a book that has been mishmashed and compiled together to try to make sense of a people who are writing retroactively about things that happened to them before in the past and giving themselves a history. And people need to understand that. You see, when people say Abraham is not a real guy or Jacob, in our community, we don't explain why we think that. So what I'm going to do is give it an academic approach where people could say, I don't think Abraham is a real guy based on the evidence that we have. And the evidence is, one of the main things is that Abraham, none of his stories can be confirmed in archaeology and history.
So Garfield goes on to reason in what I think is a totally illogical fashion.
Go into
let's see. So the position that Garfield has taken is wholly illogical. He has openly stated that due to a lack of evidence for Abraham's existence, that we can move to saying that Abraham did not exist. In logic, this is known as the fallacy of the argument from ignorance. So this is fallacious reasoning. To say that Garfield's reasoning is fallacious is to say that it lacks proper order of thought. Whenever reasoning is fallacious, we should not be persuaded by the argument as it stands, as the premises do not support the conclusion. As the slide here from a logic textbook tells you, we can divide reasoning into those cases that are cogent and thus should be persuasive, and those that are fallacious and therefore should not be persuasive. Cogent reasoning must satisfy three conditions. It must employ arguments whose premises provide good grounds for their conclusions. That is, it must be deductive. It must use deductively or inductively valid arguments. 2, the premises must be warranted, acceptable, or the reason to the reasoner question, and the premises must contain all the relevant information known to the reasoner. Fallacious reasoning is just reasoning that is not cogent, which means that either 1, it does not provide sufficiently good grounds for its conclusion, or 2, it employs unwarranted premises, 3, or it ignores or overlooks relevant information. And so we're going to get into a deductive analysis. We're going to look at his argument for validity and soundness. And a deductive argument is one in which the premises are intended to guarantee the conclusion. A valid argument is one in which it is necessary that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. With this in mind, think through the argument that Garfield has put forth. Because we lack archaeological evidence, can it be said necessarily that there is no figure such as Abraham? Even if there was no evidence of Abraham, you cannot logically say that Abraham did not exist. And this is something that's brought out by David Fisher, who writes in a book called The Historian's Fallacies, that the fallacy of the negative proof is an attempt to sustain a factual proposition merely by negative evidence. It occurs whenever a historian declares that there is no evidence that X is the case and then proceeds to affirm or assume that X is not the case, that not X is the case. A simple statement that there is no evidence of X means precisely what it says, no evidence. The only correct empirical procedure is to find affirmative evidence of not X. So when Garfield says that there's no evidence of Abraham, you cannot logically, according to historians, say that Abraham did not exist. The form of Garfield's argument takes the following form, which I've written out in a logical syllogism at the bottom. 1, he assumes, even though it's not listed there, it's an enthymeme, which makes his argument already problematic, that an ancient historical figure will have left behind archaeological evidence if we are to say that they existed. His second premise is that Abraham did not leave behind archaeological, for example, evidence. 3, therefore we can say that Abraham did not exist. This reasoning is fallacious and should not be persuasive to reasonable people. Another logic book, which I have sitting here on my shelf, details further this argument from ignorance. Says, if some proposition has not yet been proved to be true, we are not entitled to conclude that it is false. Many true propositions have not yet proven to be true. The fallacious appeal to ignorance crops up in science when plausible claims are held to be false because evidence for their truth cannot be provided. There may be good reasons for its absence. In archaeology or in paleontology, for instance, that evidence that we have may have been destroyed over time. The fact that some desired evidence has not been gathered does not justify the conclusion that an otherwise plausible claim is false. Again, this is called the argument from ignorance. And so what can archaeology actually tell us? Garfield seems to have a built-in presupposition to this argument about what archaeology can actually tell us. A few things are worth noting. Archaeology is an auxiliary science of history. History is done using written text, according to the historians that I've studied with. Archaeology is the study of trash and or discarded materials, buildings, clothing, pottery, etc., used to aid the historian. However, archaeology is limited in a vast number of ways. In The Stones in Scripture, Professor Edwin Yamaki, a historian, notes the following situation. Only a fraction of the world's archaeological evidence still survives in the ground. Only a fraction of the possible archaeological sites have been discovered. Only a fraction have been excavated, and those only partially. Only a fraction of the partial excavations have been thoroughly examined and published. Only a fraction of what has been examined and published has anything to do with the claims of the Bible. Garfield has therefore overplayed his hand. Archaeology is just not done this way. As a field archaeologist James Hoffmeyer says, no serious archaeologist thinks that direct archaeological evidence will be found that can verify the historicity of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or that the latter and his clan moved to Egypt. As a field archaeologist myself, I am keenly aware of how little has actually survived from the ancient past. Owing to natural forces such as moisture in many forms, deflation and earthquakes, as well as human impact in the form of later occupation in ancient times, reusing earlier building materials, human destruction, war and burning, and modern development, urban and agricultural, realistic expectations about what archaeology can and cannot do for biblical studies must always be kept in mind. So unless archaeology has everything, it cannot be said that it cannot be used to say what did not happen. Even scholars critical of the biblical account note that archaeology itself is not unbiased, is incomplete, and will forever remain incomplete. Kenneth Whitelam, who wrote an entire book critical of the biblical account, says, yet once again, although survey and excavation data are fundamental for the study of Palestinian settlement, unfortunately, but inevitably, we're faced with a series of partial texts. They're partial partly because not all subregions have been surveyed on the same level of
5 minutes left. 5 minutes left.
And partly because the new data generated by this switch in strategies from tell-centered archaeology is only just the beginning to be exploited in historical synthesis and the generation of new hypotheses. Moreover, however, the partiality is governed by political and theological assumptions which undermine the design or interpretation of such projects. So, and he ends up saying that the historian will always be faced with partial data, however extensive the archaeological work might be. So what do we have in archaeology? According to archaeologist David Graves, around 7,000 sites have been found in Israel. Around 4,200 sites have been surveyed. Around 150 sites have been excavated. Of the 150 excavated sites, they have not been completely excavated. Around 26 are major sites, and rarely any of the ones that have been discovered and excavated have actually made their way into the public sphere. So, but Garfield isn't wrong about everything. We do need to understand what sort of literature we're looking at when we look at the Bible. And so when we look at the scriptures, we see evidence of a historically minded people. So what exactly does the evidence show? So there's an undeniable presupposition that I think both Garfield and I share. Whether a text is history depends on what its author meant. And that's from Baruch Halpern, a historian. What's that? A historian. What's that? Okay. Speaking of Genesis specifically, Old Testament scholar John Van Sitters tells us that first, related to Genesis specifically, it is a work about ancient times, an archaeologia, a particular genre of early historiography that served as prologue to the national traditions of many states and people. As such, it shares certain characteristics with the works and must be understood at the outset of any study of the books. Secondly, it is the work of an ancient historian who shared with antiquity certain understandings about the tasks that are reflected in the nature of his writing. There's textual evidence of this in the scripture itself. And when you look at the Toledot passages display for us that the authors of these texts intended to be read as history. David Rosenberg, a translator of ancient texts in a recently published work, tells us that the text of Scripture displays careful concern for history, albeit in a Hebrew fashion. Speaking of the J source, he says much can be put together about J's background from what we know at the time. Undoubtedly, this person was well educated, steeped in a written historical tradition. Speaking of the E source, he says long before either of these biblical authors began to write, however, there had already been a history of Abraham. Although they did not merely record what was known, but infused it with a great deal of interpretation, neither did authors simply invent the tale. We know this because of the enduring Mesopotamian emphasis on history that began in Sumer, a value given to history both for its own sake, for its value to a lineage and a culture. He concludes that our study of the ancient text actually affirms the Hebrew people intended to recount the history of past events. Until the libraries of Mesopotamia were unearthed, he says, biblical commentators had little idea of what sources the Bible writers possessed. It was assumed the biblical authors were provincial, and for this reason the stories of Babylon, Babel, and the flood, Eden, and Sodom, and even the cutting of the covenant with God had been described as forceful and even ironic, but still naive, unaware of earlier history. Now we know something different. We know that the biblical writer sat among archives that contained cuneiform tablets. Even within the text of the Old Testament, specifically related to and about the stories of Abraham, we see evidence of ancient creeds and anamnesis in the biblical text. And you can see these in Deuteronomy chapter 26, for example, and in the book of Joshua. As the philosopher of history and historian says, the children of Israel turn out to be unique in a further sense. Therefore, for they stand alone amongst the people of the ancient world, in having their story of their beginnings and their primitive state as clear as this in their folk memory, and having traditional connections reaching back to such a simple stage of things. The memories of ancient Sumer did not reach behind the origin of the state. The Hittites did not tell stories about it before they had entered Asia Minor. And the ancient Greeks seem to have lost their connection with their own remoter antiquity. Other people seem to have been able to imagine for themselves an ancestry consisting of gods and heroes, though their tradition did not quite tell them what happened before or after that. Israel retained some remembrance of the missing stages. However, this might be affected by the aberrations to which the folk memory is subject. This, people said, a wandering Aramean was my father, and much of the work of archaeologists supports rather than undermines this tradition. And you can see even present scholarship supports this view that the Hebrew people were reconnecting with a past history. And so you could see from Kelly, you can see from Hendrik Bosman, that you can see from Cody, and that you can see from J.R. Lundboom. And for the sake of time, we won't get into all of those. The impact of the ancient creed statements is this, that the evidence for this early attitude to the past events and documents are much older than our Old Testament. I'll hold off till the next time.
And that's time. Finish your thought.
Documents which may have been provided to the basic pattern for the Pentateuch. The first is an ancient cultic formula, which is in the text, a kind of creedal statement to be repeated at the harvest pilgrimage festival after people have presented their offerings to the priest and had set them down before the altar. What they were instructed to say was by no means the kind of things that one would have expected on such an occasion.
All right. And now y'all know why I call him the Slim Reaper. It just ain't because he bony. So, because he bring that scholarship. My brother Garfield, are you ready? Can you hear us, brother? Garfield, can you hear us? Brother Garfield.
Well, to keep from having dead air, I'm happy to continue until he pops up.
Let me see if I can reach him on. Give us a second, fam.
Can you hear me? We
can hear you now. All right,
cool. All right. Thank you, Leandre, for the time. All right. I'm ready to go. Because my computer is messing up, share my screen for me, please. And I'm going to read an article from Reverend David Bokovoy. And I got to ask the people, you can start my time. Did he prove Abraham existed a while ago, or is he basically copy and please why you can't find it? Because if that's the case, we shouldn't have debated. Because I can't prove a negative. I understand what history is. History is about probabilities. It's not about exact science because nobody was there. So let me read an article by Reverend David Bokovoy, were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob real people? And listen to this. The book of Genesis tells the story of ancient heroes from Israel's distant past. It describes the adventures of men and women who struggled to define their relationship to divinity, as well as their place within a hostile world. But were the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob real historical figures? From the perspective of historians, that is a question we simply cannot answer. Unlike other biblical stories, the patriarchal narratives contain almost no connection with known historical events that historians can substantiate through other sources. Meaning, my brother Leandre cannot provide any evidence at all. There's nothing he can provide to prove that Abraham is real. Right now, this is just dead ear. We're just going to be talking for the sake of talking for the rest of the day. He cannot prove it. So when it comes to a person such as Abraham, we simply don't have any empirical evidence that he was real. None. There's little doubt that the stories concerning these figures, at least in part, derive from oral tradition. The written sources that appear in Genesis cannot be dated earlier than the 9th or 8th centuries BC. These sources were originally written and Hebrew did not exist as a written language until around the 10th century BCE. The internal chronology of the Bible indicates a date of around 2100 BCE for Abraham and approximately 1876 BCE for Jacob. All right. So let me move on from this article, and you have my stuff on the screen, all right?
Yes, sir.
All right. So Abraham right now and the consensus. I'm not appealing to authority, but I need to let the audience know that I'm not an expert. So I have to rely on experts. Most of the times we have to rely on the consensus to see where academia is at. Where academia is. Outside of how we feel towards Garfield or my brother Leandre. All right. On the historicity of Abraham, what does the consensus of scholarship says? There is a strong consensus among modern archaeologists and historians that the Abraham of the Bible was not a real historical person. The following is a short selection of important historians who have published during the 21st century on the subject of Abrahamic history. Wayne Pittard in Before Israel. The ancestral narratives provide little data about the background to Israel's emergence as a nation. Their function was theological rather than historical. Lawrence E. Steger in Forging an Identity. There are many reasons to be skeptical of the stories of the patriarchs as historically accurate accounts of the lives of Israel's progenitors. Indications within the narrative suggest they had a substantial prehistory as oral literature. Now let's go on to somebody else. Joseph Bleckinsopp in Abraham, the Story of a Life. We know about Abraham only from the Hebrew Bible, since no other independent source of information is currently available. Lester Grab, a matter of fact, it said the creation of a collective memory, the origins of which are now irrecoverable. Lester Grab in Ancient Israel. The patriarchal narratives in Genesis in their present form reflect a later time with many anachronistic details. K.L. Knoll in Canaan and Israel. Among literate Jews, a scroll as Genesis, which gives this reader no explicit guidance about what its contents intend to communicate, was not universally interpreted as an authoritative history, which is why some Jewish scholars feel free to rewrite the book. William G. Dever. After a century of exhaustive investigation, all respectable archaeologists, let me repeat, all respectable archaeologists have given up hope of recovering any context that would make Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob credible historical figures. Is Garfield making this up? No, he's not. I could go on and on with the consensus. But let's look at Abraham in history in context. And my brother, he laid out a very good methodology, but the issue that we have today is we have to prove historicity. And Garfield is going to make a case why it don't make sense to claim Abraham is a historical figure. Let's look at Marguerite Steiner. This book was written in 2019, right? And the context, look at this at chapter 2. It says, in search of Abraham and his descendants. And by the way, to this book, if anybody wants a copy, just email me, because it goes through all the figures and a proper methodology of how to try to find if people are history. So in the chronology, you have the Bronze Age, the Intermediate Period, the Middle Bronze Age, the Late Bronze Age, and so forth. Abraham in space and time. Now listen to the words that I'm saying, and if you're watching, freeze the screen and pay attention. Abraham in space and time. Trying to place the patriarchs in real time and space immediately induces problems. Genesis 12 to 15 provides some clues as to the location of the narrative. First, there is the name of Abraham's home city, Ur of the Chaldees, and that of his destination, Haran. The name of Abraham's promised land is Canaan. Then there are names of towns where he lived or passed through: Shechem, Gerar, Beersheba, and Hebron. However, in a superficial look at these towns reveals that they flourish mostly in periods other than those in which the Abraham narrative can be placed. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, Beersheba never existed at the time when wasn't a city at the time Abraham supposedly lived. Gerar with Abimelech, he couldn't have gone there because it never existed at the time. As a matter of fact, the Philistine wasn't in the neighborhood until the Iron Age period, which is after 1200 BC or around 1200 BC. Abraham is supposedly from 2000 to 1800 BC, depending on which scholar you listen to. So obviously already we have suspicion of the people who are writing the text. So this is what I have to show now. How do you reconcile this, my brother Leandre? Because you have a guy that's writing retroactively, like I said on that video. The city of Ur is located in southern Mesopotamia and was excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley around the 1920s. Watch this, family. Pay attention. The city flourished at the end of the third millennium. The end of the third millennium is 2000 BC. The end of the third millennium is around that time period. But watch this. It was deserted after that period. Now, when did people start living in Ur again? In the 7th and 6th centuries BC, Ur was inhabited by who? The Chaldeans, who fought many fruitless wars against the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Now look at what happened with Chaldees now, Ur of Chaldees. The place in the 6th century BC, King Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt the city on a grandeur scale. What does that mean? That means he built it up so good, it was a huge city now. So everybody in the area knew of Ur of Chaldees. That's why the writer said Abraham was from Ur of Chaldees. So Ur of Chaldees existed in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, just before and during the exile. It cannot therefore have been Abraham's home city because that story is dated long before the exile. Let's move on to another part. Haran has the same problem. The town is identified with Haran in North Syria, which is an important trade center, both in the 3rd millennium and in the Neo-Babylonian period. So Canaan is another thing. So ladies and gentlemen, what you do, you look at these cities, and what happened is these cities are what? They are being built up and also being revived during the time period of when the writing is supposedly had happened. This is why, they're writing retroactively of a glory days of a city that is present, but it wasn't present at the time when they supposedly was living. That's very suspicious. In the 1950s, you had W.F. Albright, who was the leading archaeologist. He used to use the Bible in his hand and then say, hey, and dig and say, yeah, this agrees with the Bible and all that stuff. He was a top guy when it comes to archaeology. All right. So now he says that the patriots lived in the intermediate period. 24. I'm hearing somebody's feedback. 2400 to 2000 BC. That's when he said the patriots lived. Abraham, his theory is that Abraham was a wealthy Amorite caravan trader traveling from Mesopotamia to Syria.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
5 minutes. However, the hypothesis of an Amorite invasion destroying the urban city of the early Bronze Age has since been discredited. All right. Moreover, watch this now. Hold on a second. Let me deal with this right there. The archaeological evidence does not support the existence of a major nomadic people wandering over a wide area. On the contrary, the intermediate period saw many rural societies with farming. When we go to the Middle Bronze Age, we have another problem. We have the Mari text, we have the Hammurabi text. And what happened is in the Nuzi text, we have a barren woman was obliged to give a female slave to her husband to give birth in her place, as in the story of Sarah and Hagar. That puts the Middle Bronze Age setting of the stories in jeopardy, because Abraham is supposed to be from way before. So using the Nuzi text, don't confirm, is just showing after when Abraham's supposed to have lived. Then look at this now. It also has been posited based on things that were earlier seen as anachronisms in the biblical text, that the patriarchs lived in the early Iron Age. How could he live in the early Iron Age? The Bible is putting him in 2000 BC. Examples are the mention of the Philistine king of Gerhar and the presence of Arameans. Both peoples, Philistines and Arameans, have only been identified in the region in the Iron Age, a setting of the patriarchal stories in the early Iron Age. Did Abraham live in the 1200 BC or 1000 BC? Come on, family. Let's start thinking. Then you also have T.L. Thompson and so forth. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, what we find is that you had scholars like Finkelstein, Siebelman, who started talking about when the writing was and when Abraham existed. But look at what Mario Laverani did. He said in 2005, he published a book. He talks about the first is the traditional history of archaeology remains, inscriptions, Assyrian and Egyptian texts. And this he calls a normal history. The second half of his book addresses the Sitz im Leben of the patriarchal stories. The Exodus and the Conquest, Liverani states that these stories were composed after the exile in Babylon. After his conquest of Babylon, the Persian king permitted the exiles to return to their homelands. All right. So after that, these stories mentioned above, family, then were written to create a possible blueprint for the returnees of how to live together with all these different groups, namely in isolation. The returnees were the chosen people, intermarriages were not permitted, and Yahweh was a jealous God. The stories amalgamated ancient folk traditions, historical sources, and Babylon mythological stories into an epic narrative of a people brought by God to the promised land, like the exiles from Babylonia, where they had to be taken by such and such. But anyway, Nebuchadnezzar's building projects are the similarity between the Exodus and the return of the exiles from Babylon. Liverani calls this part of the book an invented history. After Abraham, oh man, how much time I got left? After Abraham, we have
seconds.
How much?
1 minute 50 seconds.
All right, journey into Egypt, and then you see these people going into Egypt, sojourn into Egypt, Exodus, dramatic events, so forth. All right, the stories mentioned above. Hold on, let me do this. All right, hold on there. Hold on 1 second. Ladies and gentlemen, the story basically of the Babylon and all that stuff. If you look at the timeline of when it's written, you'll see like the Ur of Chaldees was a city that was established and reestablished in a large manner by Nebuchadnezzar. You're looking at the people who are writing the story from the exile time while they're in Babylon, and then now they're rewriting the history over the years. And what happened is you don't find Abraham in the northern prophets. The northern pre-exile prophets, you don't find them mentioning Abraham as the father. You'll see them mention Jacob. They don't mention Abraham as the father. They come from Abraham. Now, after the exile, you start to see these writings, because remember, all these books are dated by scholars at a certain time period. Deuteronomy around the 7th century. Then you have Genesis and Exodus after the exile. So all these writings are taking place after the exile. The 12 tribes and all the sojourn in Exodus and all those traditions, you find them after the exile. So once you figure out Abraham was never a figure way before in the history and was invented, basically based on the evidence, based on the retroactive writing, because we don't have, hold on, let me get this real fast right here. Hold on, let me get this. Oh man, hold on. So when you look at Dan, Ur of Chaldees, the kings in Genesis, Philistines, Abimelech, the camels being
That's
domesticated,
fine, but finish your thought, Garfield.
Arameans, Solomon, Gomorrah, and Beersheba, all the main elements in Genesis, those 10 main stories can't be confirmed by archaeology history. Then you have to ask yourself, what is Abraham? Is he a real person or an eponymous ancestor? Thank you.
All right. Both brothers coming out swinging. And again, family, I have to apologize, and this is human error. So what was supposed to happen, but I got thrown off because we were having some technical difficulties. What was supposed to happen was that I was supposed to allow my brother Garfield to do a 5-minute rebuttal of Leandre's presentation.
No. We do it after my.
I was just about. Okay, cool. And so what we're gonna do this time is Leandre is gonna do his second 15 minutes. Then we'll have the 5-minute rebuttal. Garfield, and then Garfield will have his second round, and then we're gonna get into a Q&A just to give y'all an idea.
No. What we can do right now, if Leandre wants to, we could do a 5-minute rebuttal right now. Because that's the first round, right? The first round is complete, right?
That's
so
it.
If he wants to, we supposed to do a 5-minute. He do a 5-minute rebuttal, then I do a 5-minute rebuttal, then he goes into round 2.
Okay, we can do it like that. That'll work. Okay, Leandre.
Yes, sir.
You good with that?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, no problem.
All right, let me get the time. You got 5 minutes to rebut. Time will start when you start. It's on you.
All right. So a couple things about Garfield's presentation. You'll notice that I think there was one source entirely in the entirety, and I think it was from William Deaver, which stated that Abraham, that they weren't, that we needed to look at them skeptically as some sort of historic figure. I can't remember the word that was used, but it wasn't that the figures don't exist, but that we need to be skeptical of their history as it relates to the Bible. Now, notice that no part of my position has anything to do with even accepting modern Christian notions of inerrancy or anything like that. So most of this is really just missing my argument entirely. He asked the question that whether or not I proved Abraham existed. Well, I don't know if he knows what proof means, but I've given evidence that Abraham existed from several times in my presentation using textual evidence and using the criteria Garfield laid out in his video, that we need to be examining the sorts of literature that we're looking at when we look at the Bible. And so one of the things that I showed is that the biblical writers used historical sources. Garfield basically showed sources saying that same exact thing. He posted sources saying something along the lines, I wrote it down, the stories amalgamated ancient folk traditions and historical sources. That means then that what you have, regardless of the date of composition, which he spent a lot of time talking about the date of composition, which is irrelevant to the subject of whether or not Abraham existed. It entirely does not matter. It certainly does not matter when you consider the fact that according to all sorts of recent scholarship and excavations, that what they know is that oral tradition was a thing in the context in which the Hebrews lived, in the context of Babylon and Sumer and Ur and so on and so forth, that you actually had great oral tradition there. And so the only point that he's made here so far is that the biblical texts were composed at some date. Nothing about my argument has anything to do with the veracity, with the date of composition. So none of those arguments are even touching the point. What he has not advanced here is any positive evidence for believing Abraham did not exist. What he actually did was circle right back around to an argument from ignorance, saying that because we don't have this, because we don't have that, then we can say Abraham did not exist. That is illogical. And Garfield admitted that, in spite of the fact that he contradicted himself in the video. In the video, he made the assertion that we can say Abraham did not exist. And then he later said, and I quote, "I cannot prove a negative." Well, logically, you can actually prove a negative. And Richard Carrier said that you can. And I can prove that there's no purple elephant behind me by the use of negative evidence. But But Garfield has not advanced anything to give us reasons for believing that Abraham did not exist. That, according to his position, various historical sources were used in the composition of the biblical text. The same thing that I said, that lends credence to the fact that characters that would have come, even if there were anachronisms, in the story, that does not suggest that the character Abraham did not exist. By the way, I just want to point out, if you look up what Garfield is talking about related to the issue of the camels, you'll actually find that he and the source that he's used is actually overplaying their hand related to the camel situation as well. The actual study on the camels only relates to one specific kind of camel in that area and in Egypt. So whether they domesticated a particular type of camel, one, does not mean that there were no camels that were there in the area. And two, there's only one specific species of camels that was actually examined. And anybody can look this up. It was one specific species of camel, and there are multiple species of camels that existed at that time. There certainly were camels in the area where Abraham would have been said to be from, and in several other places in the Middle and Ancient Near East. He then made a point that there's a lack of mention of Abraham in certain prophets. And you have to ask yourself, how is that even remotely evidence that Abraham did not exist? They probably did not mention styes on their eye or boils, that sort of thing. There's all sorts of things that they don't mention, and that's not evidence that the figure Abraham himself did not exist. Even if what you conclude here is that the Hebrew people embellished stories, that they crafted entire narratives, that says nothing related to the historicity of the figures contained therein. So I haven't seen anything here to lead to the conclusion Abraham did not exist, which is supposed to be his burden. His burden is to show that there's positive evidence to saying Abraham did not exist. So, and lastly, he says there are many reasons, according to one of the sources, to be skeptical of historical accuracy. Being skeptical of historical accuracy is not the same as being skeptical of the fact that Abraham existed, and I yield.
All right, that's time. Brother Garfield, it's on you.
All right. First of all, we got to be honest with ourselves. And I'm going to say this 3 times today, right? I got 99 problems of proving Abraham ain't one. Now, watch this. Dan, I'll say this again for everybody that didn't hear what I said because I was rushing. There are problems in Genesis, the narrative. The narrative, the Bible is considered the word of God, but we're not having a theological conversation. But watch this. We're going to look at 10 small problems that Genesis have. And you need to ask yourself, why would the Bible writers attach a figure that's historical to stories that are not true? This is evidence of why you can be suspicious. So my brother said, I have not presented. I disagree. All the evidence that you presented, you are making excuses of why you can find Abraham. You're actually making my argument for me. We could trade places right now, my brother. Now watch this. Let's look at Dan. Why is Dan a problem for Abraham being mentioned with Dan? Because Dan wasn't mentioned or a city until the times of the Judges or Joshua. This was after the Exodus. Dan was not a city. So remember, Dan is one of the tribes. So if Dan is not a tribe in the area, there could not be a city called Dan. It's called an anachronism. That's a problem. Ur of Chaldees. How could Abraham be born in Ur of Chaldees when the Chaldeans never came to the area until the first millennium BC? It couldn't be. So Abraham couldn't be there. He couldn't be. So that's another anachronism. Look at this, family. You have a war with over 12 different kings. 5 kings or whatever in Genesis 14. So you're telling me not one of those kings are legitimately historical? That's a problem. That's number 3. Philistines. Philistines weren't in the area until the Iron Age. That's a problem. How is Abraham connecting with Abimelech, which is number 5? So the Philistines weren't there. He can't. Let's go to number 5, Abimelech. He's one of the Philistines' king. So how is he in contact with Abraham at Gerar if he's not in the region? Somebody's lying. Now, with the camels being domesticated, I'll put a question sign beside that because I'm a friend of scholarship. And I'll say to the brother, if you have that research and I don't have it, I'll gladly take it on and you could email it to me so I could look at it. But from what I know, there were camels in the region, but being domesticated is the issue. It wasn't domesticated in Israel at the time. So that's number 6. Number 7, Hittites. Hittites weren't in the region until around 1600, 1650 BC, way over 200-300 years after Abraham. So he couldn't have been in contact with any king or get land from anybody who's a Hittite. That's 7 daggers. Arameans. Let's get it now. There were no Arameans in the area because the Amorites, who were absorbed into Arameans around the 1200 during the Iron Age, because you have Aramean kings who defeated the Israelites or beat them up. That's why you get the Teldan steel for David. All right. So that's 8 daggers. Sodom and Gomorrah never existed. Never existed. But we're told that his brother or his family member Lot went to deal with it and they were turned into salt. Beersheba didn't exist until the Iron Age. How is he finding Beersheba? And also, there's a double-edged story where Isaac is the one that actually found Beersheba and Abraham named Beersheba. So let's make it up. So at the end of the day, family, those are 10 daggers. And I'm going to repeat these 10 daggers later on in my next round. And in my next round, I'm going to do a cross-comparative research showing what eponymous ancestors are. Because that's all I could provide evidence of Abraham being. He's just a part of the milieu of the ancient Near East where people write stories about people and just add them on just to present what's called an etiology. Etiology is showing a creation or where you came from, your origins. So Abraham is a tradition for the people in the Hebron, in the Judah area, because the Bible is being written from a Judean perspective, not from a northern perspective. That's why the northern prophets, pre-exilic prophets, don't know Abraham. Amos don't know him. Hosea don't know him. The only person that know him in the pre-exilic time is Isaiah, and he's just mentioning something about Abraham.
That's time. Finish your thought.
How much time I got left?
That's time. But
all
finish
right,
your thought.
All right, I'm good.
All right,
now,
all right.
Now it's round 2.
Round 2, Leandre. We're going to start with 15 rounds for round 2. It's on you. Time to start when you start.
Yeah, 1 second. Let me get back to the thing in my notes for my slide was. 1 second. Peach. All right. Okay, I'm ready. Let me see. All right. It's okay, there we go. So, in spite of Garfield saying repeatedly that I presented no evidence, I've actually given loads of textual evidence using the methodology that Garfield listed before, so we'll get back into it. Present scholarship supports the view that the Hebrews are looking back to past events using the cultic creedal formula as evidence. And for example, an examination of Deuteronomy 26:5, the text is described as by Kelly as one of the Old Testament clearest and perhaps most ancient confessions that explicitly presents a historic connection. Hendrik Bosman says the same thing of Deuteronomy 26:5-11. He said it is a creed and a synthesis between old patriarchal traditions. The same thing is said by Lundbaum. He said Deuteronomy 26:5-10 is a tightly knit creed, giving further evidence that what they were doing was reaching back into history. And then Cody, even though Cody does not regard the Deuteronomy text as a creed, he regards it as an anamnesis. Nevertheless, an anamnesis means that the Hebrew people believe their literature to be history. And he says in its present ritual context, then Deuteronomy 26:5-9 is an anamnesis. Its recitation makes the offering a memorial of the past of divine acts, elicits gratitude to God for them, and leads to identification with them. Okay, wait a second. Where are we going? So the impact of the ancient creedal statements is as follows. The evidence of this early attitude of the past events in documents much older than our Old Testament, but preserved in the text. That is to say that what we have in the text, in spite of what day that it was composed or written down or put into handwriting, as if you were to write a history of your great-great-grandparents, using oral tradition. It doesn't matter the date of the composition. What matters is is whether the figures existed. It says documents which may have been provided the basic pattern for the Pentateuch. The first is an ancient cultic formula, which we just examined, a kind of creedal statement to be repeated at the harvest pilgrimage festival after people have presented their offerings to the priest and has set them down before the altar. What they were instructed to say was by no means the kind of things one would have expected on such an occasion. What the creed means for us, that the Hebrews were to recite and accept the reality of an event and the existence of persons. The event was to give a reason for the present and future actions, that the Hebrews were to recount the events of the people that led to their present state and to guide present and future actions, including a telos, has led many scholars to conclude that what we are looking at is an ancient creed about the historicity of events. Grace Karen says, in Hebrew thought, there was a one-cycle view of history. That is to say that what we're getting here is that the Jews view their present state and things that were going to happen in the future as one long story, not as Garfield presented before when he talked about literature. We know that the Hebrews were actually intending to write history. And we're going to look at further evidence of the historicity. Said the Jews viewed history as one grand cycle, beginning with the golden age of mankind, where everything was good, and an eventual return to such a time and state of being. That is, there is no separating what the Hebrew people thought of their past, their present state, or their future. This formed one entire story. The fact is, however, they did not write history in a 21st century style, but they nevertheless attempted to recount past events that had present for them and future implications. The Hebrews held that they were reading history. Old Testament historian Dr. Tramper Longman tells us the literary structure and selection of the stories intend more than a simple report of past actions. They become paradigmatic for the behavior of later generations of God's people as they respond to the promises of God. Dr. Longman tells us that the text related to Abraham read like an ancient historical account should. Without question, the main purpose of the patriarchal narratives is theological, which Garfield has said numerous times, and he thinks means that what we're not having here is history, as they present a revelation of the nature of God and of his relationship to his human creatures. At the same time, however, they're just as clearly intended us to think of this revelation as taking place within history. Theologically is inextricably intertwined with actual events in the patriarchal materials. To state this concept in a different way, the genre we are dealing with is theological history, but it is history nonetheless. The adjective does not undermine the noun. One cannot conceive of the original audience as thinking of Abraham as either as other than a real person, or of his movement from Ur to Haran to Canaan as other than a real journey. It is inconceivable that the authors of Genesis intended the audience to think that these persons and events were other than real. Scholars who use a term like saga, fiction, or folklore to describe the genre of the patriarchal narratives are therefore not so much telling us about the actual genre of the text as they are expressing their own lack of confidence, for whatever reasons, in the historical reliability of the materials. That is, they're making what they consider to be an objective assessment of the text's historicity. They're not seriously dealing with the question of genre, with the question of how the text was intended to be read. The Jews therefore saw history as a progression. As Herbert puts it, the whole panorama of history was still basically the story of the promise. The literary evidence makes this clear. As John Bright explains regarding the history of the ancient texts, the view that they were not doing history is losing steam. It has become increasingly evident that a new and more sympathetic evaluation of the patriarchal traditions is called for. The conclusion is not reached on dogmatic grounds, but because of the various lines of objective study that have played upon the problem and forced revision of previously held notions. It was easy, therefore, in the absence of an objective frame of reference for evaluating traditions, for men to doubt the historical worth of documents so far removed from the events which they tell. And Garfield has repeated this numerous times. He keeps talking about the date of composition when it is not relevant to the historicity. That this situation has radically changed hardly needs to be said. Dozens of sites have been excavated, and as material and inscriptional remains have come to light and have been analyzed, the patriarchal age has been illuminated in a manner unbelievable. We now have texts by the literal tens of thousands contemporaneous with the period of Israel's origins. Important among these are the Mari texts of the 18th century, some 25,000. I doubt Garfield has read them all. The Cappadocian texts of the 19th century, many thousands. I don't think Garfield has read them all. Thousands of documents of the first dynasty of Babylon, 19th to 16th century. The Nuzi texts of the 15th century, several thousands. The Alaka texts, the Alak texts of the 17th and 15th centuries, the Resh Shamra texts, 14th century, but containing much earlier material, the extrication texts and other documents of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, 20th to 18th century, as well as many others. Further, he states The fact that the documents, though centuries later in time, reflect authentically the milieu of the age of which they tell has brought an increased appreciation to the role of oral tradition in the transmission of the material. That much of the literature of the ancient world, epic tales, traditional lore, legal and liturgical materials, was handed down orally is universally recognized. It can hardly be doubted that J and E transmit material drawn from the common stock of the ancient traditions. And would you know that the J and E sources, according to people who hold to the documentary hypothesis, are the particular texts containing the stories of Abraham. So you cannot just say that because of the date of composition that what they're talking about the historical figures, that the historical figures didn't exist. That again is a logical fallacy. Abraham also fits the time period very well. And so, for example, we read, like the patriarchs, most of the prophets associated with the Mari documents were of West Semitic stock as revealed by their personal names and their idiom. Personal names were a sort of ethnic calling card in antiquity. And such names Abraham, Ishmael, Laban, Leah, and Jacob were current at Mari. The name Jacob is to be found in Akkadian documents from other sites as well, from the 19th to the 17th centuries BCE. And again, this requires no loose reading of the text. The name type Abraham is also attested as example, which is Abishar. Abarana appears in the 19th century Egyptian execration text. That's A.R. Millard, which is one of the sources Garfield pointed to before. What a treat that he cited that one. Abarama appears in Dilbat, circa 1900 BCE, and that's George Barton. The personal name Abraham is found also in Mari, Ebla, Ugarit, and Cyprus. If you factor in the activity of Abraham, then of course, there's a whole host of other things. But I don't even need to argue this because Garfield has readily admitted the amount of historically accurate data that we have in the text. So, but what are we to conclude? Just using the background or textual evidence only leads us to a likely conclusion. Daniel Bedford tells us that the biblical accounts reflect a story that was native in origin to the folklore memory of the Canaanite enclaves of the southern Levant, which lived on in the Hebrews. The Canaanite origin of these figures is now only dimly reflected, as most of the biblical stories about them took shape much later and served etymological needs felt by Israel in the first millennium BC. But these themselves were undoubtedly bona fide historical figures of the Middle Bronze Age. Daniel Bedford is no friend of the biblical account. And so what I've done here is I've actually compiled an entire list of scholarship that a lot of which are not actually friendly to the biblical account, who no less attest to the historicity of these particular figures, especially again as you consider the fact that there is historical likelihood, given the background that we're told of these particular texts. Anachronisms do nothing related to the historicity of biblical figures. So what we have in the biblical text is a reflection of earlier past traditions that would have been passed down as oral traditions, not unlike various other histories that we know about. I can give you several examples that you can look up at any time you want to. If you want to study the history of pre-Socratic, I'm flying off the cuff here, the history of pre-Socratic philosophers, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Xenophanes, and any number of other people. The majority of what you have about these particular people is in written text with no archaeological data or anything else to back it up. And nonetheless, scholars accept that these were historical figures. So I'm not using even a remotely inconsistent historiography here when I'm talking about Pythagoras, Heraclitus. It could be Socrates. It could be Hesiod. It could be Homer. It could be stories about Homer, which were with the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were once said not to be historical events until sites were excavated finding the city of Troy. And so it would have been equally as illogical to claim that because there was nothing to corroborate the story of Homer and Hesiod and his theogony, or the Iliad and the Odyssey, that we could say that the people didn't exist, whether we're talking about the authors or the stories themselves. We've actually found the sites of the king of Minos, which is where Manoah gets his name. The same thing with the Mycenaeans, and we've even confirmed certain things that have taken place in Troy. So, contrary to what's been stated, I've not actually just sat here and said, why we can't find archaeological data. I've actually used archaeological data to bolster the veracity of the claim that Abraham existed, and to say why it would be a reasonable conclusion to draw that Abraham did exist. And this includes the literary evidence. What does the biblical text tell us? Garfield says this was the criteria. Garfield said that we have to look at the literature of the Bible to see what they were trying to communicate. And that's what we did. That was his standard. And so he said that that's what we needed to do. That's what I offered. So when we look at the biblical text, we see that the biblical writers were believing themselves to be communicating history. We see that they were compiling history. We see that they were working with a myriad of sources. Garfield all but admitted exactly that. So talking of anachronism is only evidence that there were later changes to the particular story, that which could have come about for any number of reasons, including giving someone a geography. If I talked about Native Americans, the phrase Native American is itself an anachronism if I'm talking about the past, because they were not called Native Americans, but 500 different names, at least 500 different names of different nations. So talking about an anachronism and Beersheba or Gerar, it means absolutely nothing. And it still does not serve as any sort of positive evidence that Abraham did not exist. So I believe that I've met my burden here today, and I will yield now and wait for a response.
All right, you had 2 minutes left. You sure you want to yield?
Yes, indeed.
All right, Brother Garfield, it is on you, my friend.
You can share my screen. I'm about to put up my audio book for my book, right? And I think Leandre's voice would have been nice for my audio book because he's definitely a very good reader. But anyway,
everybody go get Garfield book too.
Ladies and gentlemen, did he prove Abraham existed? No, he has not put out anything. And as a matter of fact,
start your time.
Start my time. As a matter of fact, the information that he talked about as far as the name Abraham in archaeology they have confirmed it in the movie, that documentary that Finkelstein did in 2001. They show that they found people with the name Abraham, but they don't match with the route that they took as far as traveling and so forth. It don't match with Abraham, so it didn't fit to the Abraham. So yes, that was a common name. All right. Now, as far as anachronism, I'm going to say this to everybody. If I'm writing a story about Abraham, remember, this is the word of God. I'm speaking theologically now, right? And this is the word of God. If it's being transmitted now that I had a war with 5 kings and those 5 kings didn't exist, what would you call that? Why are you writing that story? Why are you saying that you helped to start a city that didn't exist 700 years before your supposed time period? That anachronism is a major problem. Not only minute, it is a major problem to talk about somebody telling a story that's tradition. Abraham, ladies and gentlemen, and if you read Mario Liverani's book, he actually has a theory that I don't even want to say in this debate because I don't want to put nothing out there to help some of these crazy arguments. But anyway, let me get to this right now. Are the 12 tribes historical characters? When you look at Medes as the progenitor of the Medes, when you look at Ashur, who is the eponymous ancestor for the Assyrian god or deity, when you look at Perseus, who is the person who started the Persian Empire, or when you look at Helene, who is the head of the Hellenistic Greeks, who they say they come from, when you look at Romulus, who Rome said they come from, ladies and gentlemen, when you look at Jacob or Israel, where they say they come from, it all boils down. Guess what? None of these people existed, family. They're all called eponymous ancestors. All these cultures write a history, trace it back to somebody that don't normally exist. So this is nothing new that the biblical writers do. They're just doing what they learned in the norm. They're just doing what they're doing. Think about it, family. Romulus, Helen, Perseus, Ashur, Medusa, all are not real people. The Greeks had a whole station for the 10 tribes. Right here. It's right here. The eponymous ancestors. Look at 508 BC to 307 BC. They talk about the eponymous ancestors and their heroes. It's right here. So now, was Abraham and eponymous ancestors like the Greek heroes? I propose this. Eponymous ancestors are well known from Greek and Latin literature. The ancestral hero Aeolus has 12 children who are the eponymous ancestors of their settlement. Sounds familiar, right? Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Why does Abraham being real matters to my brother Leandre? You know why, Black Lion? Because of Jesus and the New Testament. That's the only reason why he want to debate. Jesus' genealogy has Abraham in it. Jesus claimed that he existed in John 8:58. Jesus said that the Gentiles would have a feast with Abraham. James used Abraham as an example of faith. So if Abraham is not real, it makes Jesus a liar. That's the only reason why he's doing this debate. Because he's sensitive. Oh, they say, oh, they're going to make Jesus out to be a liar. You better beat him up. Why would a real person be attached to fake stories? Let's take a look. The question is sometimes asked whether it is reasonable to assume that Israelites would have told stories about imaginary ancestors. Why would ancient Israelites have accepted traditions about these people if they were not in fact real? The truth is, however, that we have plenty of examples in the ancient world where mythological figures, including divinities, were understood to be real, even though we know that they weren't. They're just following the playbook, family. That's all it is. Ancestor stories. Some scholars theorize that the ancestor stories were created in such a way to connect the origins of Israel with Mesopotamia, Abraham's original homeland, rather than the land of Canaan. That's all it is. That's all it is, family. Let's take a look at examples of these ancestral stories and put them side by side with Abraham. Moshe Winefield, the promise of the land, the inheritance of the land of Canaan by the Israelites. You have a tradition of a man leaving a great civilization and charged with a universal mission. You have Aeneas from Rome and you have Abraham. They both left for a city. One left for Troy, one left for Ur. One stayed in Carthage, the other one stayed in Aram. One reached to Canaan, the next one reached to Asanius, Lavinium. They were destined to rule the world. One had a promise over the whole world. An ethnic tradition later developed into an imperial ideology, a divine promise to a father of a nation. Let's look at another example. Number 2, Jupiter prophesies Aeneas that 332 years will pass before the birth of the twins and the founding of Rome. God promised Abraham that 400 years would pass before his descendants inherited the land, 430. Then you had the promise. Aeneas had a promise. Jacob had a promise. Then you had the pious ancestor, like the Abraham to David imagery. Then you have the Aeneas to Augustus imagery. You had the ancestral gods. Let us consider the motive of ancestral gods transferred to the newly founded site. And by the way, I'm not saying that the Bible writers copied Rome, by the way. And I'm not saying the Roman writers copied the Bible. I'm saying it's a universal story that's told in the ancient Near East milieu. And it's just that the Bible writers follow the script. They just follow the script, the burial place of the founder. These are all different things that you need to connect. Let's look at Sodom and Gomorrah and Ovid. Ovid was written around 8th century AD. And again, I'm not saying that the Bible copied or they copied. I'm saying that they both had the same storyline in the ancient Near East. The Sodom and Gomorrah story, look at it almost word for word. You see the same storyline in both stories. How is this possible? Because they're all from the ancient Near East. Yahweh reveals his identity. Jupiter reveals his identity. Abraham and Sarah desire a child. Harriet desire. I'm talking word for word. The visitors' divine identities are a secret. The visitors' identities are a secret. Come on. I'm not saying nobody copied from nobody. This Garfield ain't none of that fake scholarship stuff. I'm saying this story was in the ancient Near East. And a lot of different cultures use the same story. To summarize, the historical and geographical reality of these places is disputed. The story of Abraham, Lot, and divine visitors combines these earlier biblical traditions with the story of Gibeah. And look at this, ladies and gentlemen. Did you know the biblical Sodom and Gomorrah story is invoked in a Greek pagan love spell discovered among the magical papyri? Look at it. The heavens of heavens opened and the angels of God descended and overturned the 5 cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Adama, Zeboim, and Segar. A woman heard the voice, became a pillar of salt. Same story. Abraham got 99 problems and historicity is 1. Let me go over this one more time. How much time I got left, my brother? I'm going to go over
7 minutes. 7 minutes.
One more time for the audience. I want you to pay attention. Why would Abraham be talking about visiting the city of Dan if Dan did not come out of the Exodus yet? What oral tradition are you following? What are you following? So that's a problem. That means your oral tradition is wrong. Somebody is spreading a lie. Why would you come from Ur of Chaldees if you come from Sumer or Shinar? Why did you say that Abraham from Shinar? Why say Ur of Chaldees, which didn't exist until 9th century BC? Why? Why the kings in Genesis 14 that went to war, none of them has been proven to have existed, including Amraphel and Chedorlaomer? Why is Abraham mentioning Philistines and all his connection with Philistines and all that stuff if the Philistines weren't in the area at the time? And by the way, too, if you study the Bible properly, you realize that the Philistines were the nastiest set of people. This is why a lot of laws that the Israelites have is totally against what the Philistines stood for, like not eating pork, not doing certain things, because they found the pork, the pig that came into the Levant was brought by the actual Philistines. Abimelech, connected to the Philistines as a king, couldn't meet Abraham in Gerar or Isaac because they already passed and gone 700 years before. I'm going to pass the camels domesticated. The Hittites weren't in the region until 1650. So how is Abraham buying property or mingling with them if the Hittites weren't around? Arameans never existed around when Abraham was. 700 years later, Sodom and Gomorrah, the brother in the chat, Lou, said, yes, they did say that the spot happened around 1600 BC. This place, some firebomb hit it, and that was Sodom and Gomorrah. But ask yourself this question. What time period was that? 1600. And actually, those people had to retract some stuff. I'm very familiar with it. Beersheba, Isaac and Abraham is said to have created Beersheba. Now, what is a doublet, family? A doublet is when a story is told twice by the same person in the same book by two different people saying they accounted for something. Let's take a look at a doublet for a minute. We have Isaac and we have Abraham. Isaac moves on account of famine. Abraham moves on account of famine. Isaac settles in Gerar. Abraham settles in Gerar, which was ruled by Amalek. Why sister? Afraid of the locals in Gerar, Isaac passes off Rebekah as his sister. Abraham does it twice. He does it in Egypt and he does it in Gerar. He says that Sarah was his sister. Same story. Isaac becomes very rich in flocks and herd. So does Abraham. Wealth. Oath. They both take an oath. They both say that they were the reason why Beersheba got its name. Why is the same story told in the same book that's inspired by God, telling that two different people were the reason why the name Beersheba was given? And at the end of the day, both of them couldn't have named Beersheba because Beersheba wasn't established until 700 years later. 700 years later, dead. So if you want to consider all these things to wonder, hey, did Abraham exist or not? I'm saying that it doesn't match up. If you can't confirm one thing in the story and say, hey, you know what, this possibly happened for real, then I don't have to prove. I have put out enough evidence for you to be suspicious or to say, hey, Abraham is suspect. We are not stupid. We need a witness. We need something. We need some sort of archaeology, history, some sort of tradition. And we know that Aeneas is not a real guy. We know a lot of people in the Greek culture, eponymous ancestors, are not real. This is what they do. We know Ashur is not real. We know Medusa is not real, the leader of the Medes. We know Perseus is not real. But only the biblical characters that have etiology attached to it have real characters. Listen, family, it's just a simple writing. Jacob, Isaac, Abraham, all these characters are considered eponymous ancestors. This is why they don't look for them anymore. Point blank, period. And let me say this. Did he prove Abraham existed? Did I prove? You can't prove Abraham don't exist. With historians, what they talk about is probability. The probability of Abraham being a real person is almost zero. The possibility of him being being real as an individual. I've put enough information out there to have you think. That's all my job is. He's saying that Abraham existed. I'm saying no. He has to prove it. He has not proven one thing. He has proven to be a very good reader, an excellent reader, very eloquent reader, I must say. And I'll say this, the anachronisms are important. The King's List are important. When the book was written is important because you're supposed to be carrying on a tradition, an oral tradition of truth, not lies. So when do you find Yahweh? Something that's very important. When do you find Israelites' history of Yahweh? Because remember, in Genesis, it says Yahweh appeared as El Shaddai, right? When did that happen? Do we have a record of Yahweh in the 18th century BC, 2000 BC? Do we have Yahweh at all? Records. There's no records of Yahweh with the Israelite until around 9th century BC. So even if you look at it from a deity position, where is the record of this God with the Israelites? You don't find it. All it is a story, family. This is why you have problems proving the Exodus.
One minute.
This is why you don't have anyone, and I'm gonna say this carefully to everybody. This is why we have arguments about these people not existing in the conscious community. It's not that I'm not saying that 100% he don't exist, because in history we deal with probabilities. The probability is almost zero for this gentleman being a real guy. But the only reason why my brother Leandre is here is because if Abraham don't exist and he feels he's superior to us because of this Jesus belief, that means that his religion, Jesus, is a liar. That's the only reason why. And I subscribe to Jesus being a historical guy, but not the supernatural Jesus. But I'm saying this to say that Abraham, you have not proven to anybody out there that this guy exists. Nobody. You have not proven, not one time. The consensus is on my side, the experts. I've shown eponymous ancestors. I've shown over...
That's time. Finish your thought, Garfield.
And I've shown over 10 different examples why we should not trust the narrative of Abraham, period. Thank you.
All right. Garfield throwing daggers. Leandre, the Slim Reaper, got out his scythe. We got a fight. All right. So this is the time for 5-minute rebuttals. We're going to start with the Slim Reaper. Time to start when you start.
I want you all to notice that Garfield has already conceded the debate. I'm not sure if Garfield has ever actually had an actual debate instead of the Sonnetter style, but an actual debate. The proposition before us is that I have to give evidence to prove that Abraham existed. He has to give evidence that Abraham did not exist. That is what he said on video. And so when he said, I do not have to prove that Abraham did not exist, and he talked about making you skeptical instead, Garfield actually lost the debate according to rules of debate. Now, because I know some of the people in the chat have never actually seen an actual debate, they don't know this. So I'm just want to make you aware. He actually has to prove Abraham did not exist, which is what the historians said his burden is. And that was in some of my original slides there, David Fisher, the historian's fallacies, where you actually have to give evidence that not X is the case. You cannot just say that because there's no evidence of X. Also, I was not actually here to prove the veracity of biblical stories. What I'm actually here to prove is the evidence for a biblical Abraham, the evidence that Abraham himself was a historical figure who existed, not whether any story about him is likely. And so what you've heard repeatedly is called the fallacy of irrelevant thesis. So because we're asking one question, did Abraham exist? And Garfield is responding to a different question entirely, wholly illogical, is whether or not the particular stories about Abraham happened exactly as the Bible records they did. Now, that was not the position I took in this debate, and I didn't take that position here on purpose because that's not the proposition before us. He says, you can't prove that Abraham didn't exist. Then that means that Garfield has lost the debate according to rules of debate. Stop what you're doing right now and Google him. He actually has to prove the proposition before us today. Garfield then moved to talking about other people because he then kept saying that, we can't prove that Abraham or any other any other firicals, or eponymous ancestors, for example, that they didn't exist, which again is the same fallacy. He kept saying, we know that blank are not real. We know that this person is not real, Asar, so on and so forth. And he's committing the same fallacy, which again, he has no business in a debate if he does not know how this works. Because the only thing that he did, he just reasoned circularly. How can we say Abraham didn't exist? Because he was an eponymous ancestor. And what evidence is that? Eponymous ancestors did not themselves exist. He talked more about anachronisms. He talked a whole lot about 10 problems with Genesis. And that has nothing to do with proving that Abraham did not exist, which is his burden. So when you judge a debate, you're judging it based on the proposition and who put forth the best evidence for their position. Garfield has already conceded he cannot do that. I offered evidence in support of Abraham's existence, using the literary evidence, using the evidence from various other ancient texts that show that they were historically concerned, that ancient people were historically concerned, and that the Hebrews more so. And I listed multiple resources from scholarship. Garfield keeps talking about consensus. I don't know when the last time Garfield checked the consensus, but I'm actually going to ask him, and we're going to get specific about consensus here. So Garfield, this is a warning now to be ready for that question, because you've referenced consensus on numerous occasions, and this happened on the original video. Garfield also made repeated numerous fallacious ad hominem arguments, saying that the reason that I want this position to be true is because if Abraham didn't exist, that makes Jesus a liar. But even that's a contradiction from what Garfield said in the previous video. He says, does it make Jesus a liar because Jesus said something about Abraham? And Garfield answered the question, no. And so he's tripping all over himself, contradicting himself, trying to establish a negative, which he has already admitted he cannot do. According to the rules of debate, Garfield has actually lost the debate because he surrendered the proposition. Garfield has asked questions about why would the biblical writers attach historical figure to events that did not exist. Garfield, I hope that you are ready, because what's going to happen is I'm going to quiz you on that specifically. And I'm warning you ahead of time because you're going to be caught with your pants down.
1 minute. 1 minute.
He talked about there being little or no historical memory of pre-Israelite events or circumstances in Genesis. And what does that have to do with whether Abraham existed? Does it have anything to do with whether Abraham himself was a figure? It could possibly be. On my position, the position I've taken in this debate, it could possibly be that the stories that the Hebrews adopted, and for the sake of this argument, I'm saying the Hebrews adopted earlier stories from sources. That what they did was they took stories, which Garfield has said they got from various other sources, an amalgamation of other historical sources, and then they gave Abraham a completely different history. He talked about finding names of different people. It could very likely be, contrary to Garfield's position that he's supposed to take, that one of those figures named in those time periods was the actual Abraham, and the Hebrews crafted an entire story about him. The only thing I need to show is that is a likely position. Garfield has already opened the door to that, and again, over and over and over again, Garfield has conceded the debate. I'm really looking forward to the question and answer period. Thank you.
All right. Brother Garfield, 5 minutes and start.
You know what's crazy? I'm very honest and ladies and gentlemen, he's trying to make up his own rules as he go. And when you're dealing with historicity, there's no 100%. There's no 100% here. There's a percentage and there's probability, and he knows this. So I can't say 100% this didn't happen or this did happen. We are not there. That's how historians work. And you should know that, my brother. You're in school right now. You know that if even with the consensus, there's no 100% consensus. All a consensus is the majority of the scholars. So when I brought out a book like the book of Genesis, the book of Genesis is basically saying biblical scholars have long sought to identify authentic historical memories from the pre-Israelite period within the narratives of Genesis. Now, I didn't say that. This is what the book of Genesis is saying. The Genesis stories, a particularly patriarchal period, turns out to have been misplaced. Remember earlier he quoted that they had such and such amount of married text, the Nuzi text. This is what it says. Textual and archaeological evidence, Mary and Nuzi and other second millennium sites were interpreted very loosely to or were taken as local customs when in fact they represented widespread Near Eastern norms. Like I talked about norms. The current consensus is that there is little or no historical memory of pre-Israelite events or circumstances in Genesis. This is why yesterday, you can't prove a negative, bro. Don't fall for the okie doke. You're right. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, yesterday on my show at Brother Garfield podcast, I showed the book Ancient Near East Literature in Old Testament Text by Pritchard. Because what it does, it shows you the verses in the Bible and where the intertextuality and where it comes from. So that means the stuff in the Bible is not original per se, is that these people lived in different cultures and created a narrative for themselves. Now, whether you want to believe that theory or not, that's up to you. But that book, Ancient Near East Literature in the Old Testament, proves a lot. It shows some of the stuff word for word. That's why we know Psalms 104 for the Egyptomaniacs out there. They like to talk about that. But the point I'm trying to make is, he never proved Abraham existed, family. When? All he gave you was a possibility based on, when we write literature and, we're writing from this and write from that. And he has even made the argument I thought he was going to make. That's a very convincing argument. He made an argument saying, hey, I'm following a certain methodology. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this forward based on what this is. No, if you weren't a believer, you would have never held that position. You're holding a believer's position. You're not holding a balanced position. You're a believer, so you're protecting your belief. That's all it is. It's based, so your motives of protecting Jesus makes a lot of sense. So now I'm saying to you, you never proved that. All I did was dismantle the whole Genesis story, which makes sense if you're saying it's a tradition that is true. I'm saying it can't be true because of these reasons. So of course I'm going to bring up anachronisms and say there's no way he could have built Beersheba the well if he lived 800, 700, 800 years before. I'm trying to let the people in the audience think for themselves. So that's, you could come with whatever you want to come with. I'm ready, guns blazing. All I'm saying, those 10 things I brought up, he cannot respond to them because it proves that the narrative in itself is based off fiction. Hence, if it's a fictitious narrative, why are you attaching a real person to a fictitious narrative based on the ancient Near East milieu and the history of eponymous ancestors? You can say, hey, Abraham falls into this one. Abraham is just a popular name. It
1 minute.
And that's all it is. I'm not going to say I'm right or wrong about if he existed or not, because technically you're the one that called out for the debate. You want to say Abraham existed. You are the pro person. That's your job. Your job. I remember Carrier debating Damon Richardson, and he said, I don't have to do nothing. It's your job to prove Jesus existed. You don't prove a negative. No, you don't. And he said that in that debate. So if you're quoting Carrier, I don't know if he said something else another time, you can't prove a negative. You can't. So if you're trying to fool the people into saying, hey, support me because this and that, no, my brother, the game time is over. Garfield is a different breed. So again, if you're interested to be the voice in my ebook, oh, I would love that. But at the end of the day, you have not proven anything today at all.
Sign me up, by the way.
That's what's up. I'm out. That's it, brother.
That's time.
Although he jumped in and interrupted me, but it's all good. So we ain't have no disrespect or nothing. So that's what's up.
Yeah, it been a real good dialogue so far. No disrespect whatsoever. Let's see if we can keep it that way on this Q&A. So we got 7 minutes. Leandre, you're gonna ask Garfield. You have 7 minutes to ask Garfield a series of questions. Garfield, you're gonna answer as many of them as you can within that 7 minute time frame. Leandre, the time will start when you're ready to start.
All right. Garfield, what is a consensus in scholarship?
A consensus of scholarship is basically the majority of scholars on each issue that they are researching. Basically, if somebody's researching Jesus, if Jesus existed, the majority of the historians who are actually in academia that is registered as historians, the majority of them being the ones who actually agree that he existed, would be the consensus. So if, say, for example, you have Art Ehrman, who's agnostic / atheist, you have a Craig Evans or whoever else who says Jesus existed, those are the people who are known scholars who basically say, hey, Jesus existed. But the people who say he don't exist, the only person that people actually recognize is actually Dr. Richard Carrier. There's really not much out there to say, hey, he don't exist. Although there are people out there, he's the actual main one who pushes that Jesus don't exist.
Okay. And when was the last time you checked the consensus on the issue of Abraham's existence?
I think like around probably 6-7 months ago.
Okay. And what was it the one you cited about there being little or no sort of historical connection to the past? Is that supposed to be related to the question of Abraham's existence?
Yes.
Okay. So let me ask you a question, because you made the point. You asked, why would they connect the story of Abraham with sort of events that didn't happen? Are in the scriptures, are the places that they list, are those accurate places?
Not accurate places as far as what?
Did the places exist?
Of course, some of the places, of course, they exist, as far as I know. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you admit then that simply connecting something to an event that didn't happen doesn't mean that what you're talking about didn't exist, right? So like you can have a city that exists and events about the city be fictional, right?
Yeah, you don't ask and answer the question, but let me say this.
Well, I didn't ask and answer your question, sir, but I do. My clock is ticking. My clock is ticking, sir. Can you have the names of cities and places? Can those people be historical and events about the places be not historical?
Events about the places not historical? Sure, that's possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then, is it possible that Abraham could have been a historical figure, and yet things written about Abraham, his life, and that sort of thing, that Abraham is still could still be a historical figure? Is that possible?
Another leading question, if it's possible.
These are supposed to be leading questions, sir. This is a cross-examination. It's supposed to be leading.
Let me answer, brother. Let me answer. I would say it makes more sense for somebody to tell the truth about something, especially from a theological perspective, if it's supposed to be the word of God.
Well, right. Except for we're not here debating if it's the word of God. We're here debating whether or not Abraham was a historical figure. So aside from that question, is it, because I wasn't sure of your answer, can you have events written about a person who existed in reality, yet the events about the person's life not be historically accurate?
Yeah, when you create an etiology as far as anybody else, I mean, you can. It's possible.
Okay. You said that they found evidence of the name of Abraham in other places. Could one of these possibly have been the historical Abraham, just with a different story?
No.
Okay, why not?
Because if someone is telling a story of Abraham, you're actually it's another leading question. But let me just say this:
this is a cross-examination. All questions are supposed to be leading, sir.
If you are creating a narrative of an individual, right? Mm-hmm. And you're saying that person has a name. So if I'm writing a story, somebody's writing a story about me after I pass 1,000 years from now, and there's 20 other Garfields. So you're basically saying that this Garfield they could attach me to one of those Garfields. That's not me.
Right. Except for you still haven't answered my question. What's the methodology for determining that Abraham? No, hang on, sir. This is my question after time. My clock is ticking.
Let me finish answering.
What's the methodology, sir?
Hold on. So basically, they would be adding me to a Garfield that don't exist. That's not me. That's what you're saying. So they're adding an Abraham to an Abraham that wasn't the Abraham. Okay, you're making a lot of sense. Thanks.
Okay, so no, Garfield, and you didn't answer my question. Let me ask you a question, because you brought up the historicity of Jesus earlier. Are there accounts of Jesus in non-canonical texts that completely change the history of Jesus from what we know of the canonical text?
My brain ain't working right. I don't recall.
Okay, yeah. So
Tacitus is flashing in my head. I remember Tacitus mentioned the crucifixion and all that stuff. So
okay, right. So are you familiar with the Talmud and the other New Testament apocrypha?
The Talmud storyline. Which one? Because there's a couple of
well, Jesus is referred to repeatedly in the Talmud, but this is my question answer time. If you're not familiar, we'll just move on. Is it not true that in various other non-canonical gospel texts, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, so on and so forth, that there's a different picture of Jesus historically there than what you have in the canonical gospels?
Yes, that is true.
Okay, so what is your methodology for saying that what we find in these other Abrahams with these different histories, aside from simply presupposing that those other texts are accurate and the biblical text is not, what's your methodology for knowing that they're not referring to the same historical figure, events aside?
Based on their the routes that they took, based on what they did personally and which culture they come from.
Right. And are you presupposing the truth of those other stories? Because it sounds like you are.
Presupposing the truth? No, I'm basing it on what.
Okay. So are the other stories accurate about the account of Abraham?
The account of Abraham for their culture or Abraham in the Bible?
For Abraham for their culture.
No, I wouldn't say whether it's true or not. I wouldn't know. I wouldn't say.
Okay. Okay. Is it possible? Is it possible that their history of Abraham is wrong and they're talking about the same figure?
It's possible that the Abraham is a popular name.
Right, but that wasn't the question I asked, was it?
It's possible that Abraham, those stories are true, and the Abraham in the Bible is false.
Right. So, is the converse true?
No.
Okay. So the converse is not possible. So it must be, if I'm understanding, and you correct if I'm wrong, is it your view that the other texts related to Abraham are correct and the biblical text is wrong?
That's time. Finish the thought.
Well, that's up to following a proper methodology and make a determination, but we can't say yes or no to that.
Thank you.
All right, good job, bro. I appreciate that. All right, so my turn now to ask the questions.
Yes, sir. Time will start when you start.
All right, can you give me a particular evidence that you actually pointed out during this dialogue between us today? I wouldn't even call it a debate, a dialogue that we had today that proved in your mind and convinced you that Abraham is real.
Well, yeah. So first, I think that there's a problem with your question because I think that you're misusing the word proof. I've given evidence that Abraham existed, which leads to a necessary conclusion. One of those is the textual evidence, the presence of the creeds in the text. I used the methodology that you had laid out in your original video that sparked the conversation we're having here today. We're talking about understanding the particular literature of the biblical text. And so what we see when looking at the biblical text is that the writers intended it to be history. And so just like if I was compiling history of ancient Greece, if I was looking at various fragmentary texts or comments about the particular pre-Socratic philosophers, for example, what we're looking at is textual evidence, which is actually how history is done. So I'm looking at historical documents, which is my argument that the Bible is.
Okay. Is it possible that Abraham never existed at all?
Oh, yes, it is. It is within the realm of possibility that every person on the planet who's ever talked about him is clinically insane, or that I'm imagining this whole conversation. No. Yeah, I'm answering. It is within a realm of possibility, but it is not likely.
It is not likely. Okay. All right. What internal evidence have you seen within the biblical text to say, hey, Abraham is more than likely a real person?
Well, yeah. So one of the things that I pointed out repeatedly is the presence of creed or an anamnesis in the biblical text, which reaches back to further times past. These things are corroborated with various other ways that ancient people did history. And so what they're supposed to confess is one uniform story of starting with the promise of Abraham, leading to their present condition and everything going on in the future. So what we have there is a historical statement that this is what we believe happened. It's the same. It's the similar formula that we get in 1 Corinthians 15 related to the existence of Jesus and the resurrection. You still see that creed, which tells you the way that the Hebrew people, what the Hebrew people believed about history.
Is it true that would you agree that Abraham fits? Is it possible Abraham could fit the eponymous ancestor title more? Is it more evidence to prove that he's an eponymous ancestor than an actual real person?
Yeah, well, so the thing is, I reject the notion of an eponymous ancestor, and I think that, and that's one of the things I tried to point to about, I think Skillman is his name, but he excavated sites related to ancient Troy, and they thought the same thing about King Manoah, who they named the Minoans after. That was a position that was held particularly about him as well. But so I reject the notion outright that we can declare that they're eponymous ancestors. So I don't think that fits.
Okay. All right. What about as far as Abraham and the internal evidence that you talked about as far as writing? Would you agree that there is some sort of bias at times regarding looking at evidences, especially internal, seeing that there's not much follow-up or additional sources to agree with the internal?
Yeah, well, so I don't know that I don't know that that's something that's a bias, but that was one of the things Tremper Longman had sort of noted about the theological nature of specifically regarding the Pentateuch or of the entirety of Scripture. But this is not something that's uncommon. If we were talking about the history of Socrates, for example, we're going to work with Plato or Aristotle, and they had a bias, and they were followers of the particular person, and even when they critique pre-Socratic philosophers and that sort of thing, that what we're getting is not a completely unbiased position, but it doesn't make it less historical. Yes, it's something that's through a particular lens, but one of the other things that Dr. David Fisher highlights is in the historian's fallacies is that there is a fallacy, which he calls the Baconian fallacy, where people who claim to be historically concerned think that when you're doing history or even interpreting history later, that you have to approach it with no presuppositions. Well, that's not true, because there are ways to account for those sorts of things. So whether in the writing or interpreting of history, that sort of appeal to bias is itself illogical. You don't need to do the sort of Descartes or a Baconian fallacy where you have to rid yourself of all presuppositions to be doing actual history. That's a 21st century way of doing history. That wasn't the way most ancient history or proto-history was done itself. So I don't see that as a problem.
Outside of the when you look at the Maridanusi and other texts from the second millennium BC, do you what evidence outside of the name Abraham would convince you that they're referring to actual Abraham in the Bible?
Well, yeah, well, so one of the things dealing with proto history, you're obviously going to be dealing with scant sources. So one of the things that's convinced several scholars that I know of, and I would also challenge your notion of consensus that you talked about repeatedly. But one of the things that's convinced numerous scholars is how well the particular story fits within the framework. And so you have Abraham as a semi-nomadic pastoral sort of living a semi-nomadic pastoral sort of lifestyle. And so the things related to Abraham fits. There's historical context and things that that say that this is a continuation of an early tradition regarding Abraham. And so this has convinced scholars, which contrary to what you said before, like Daniel Bedford, to think that Abraham was a bona fide historical figure.
If you close the Bible right now, would you be able to provide any evidence that Abraham was a historical figure?
Well, yes, and no. Yes, in the sense that, like I said, we've talked about Abraham in these other places. So if the text of Scripture itself did not exist, you still have the presence that you've already talked about and conceded to, that Abraham is stuff in other places. But that also just says that there's a bias against the source of the Bible as history. You don't do history by discarding a source. And Bart Ehrman would tell you this when talking about the historicity of Jesus. He says that what we are going to learn about Jesus, you're going to have to go to the New Testament text to do. And so you're not doing honest history if you say, if I exclude this source here, what can we say about it then? Well, that's just not how history is done. I've taken history classes like history of the West. My textbook, Making of the West, one of the things when recounting the history of Israel, it cites from the Pentateuch. This is a history book. And so it's not history to remove the Bible from discussion, even though that's common in conscious circles to say that you need to do.
That's time. That's time. Finish your thoughts.
Nah, don't worry about it. It's all good.
All right. So with that being done, I think this was an excellent conversation. Both brothers showed a lot of respect. Once again, I got to say thank you to both brothers taking time out their busy schedule to come over to the platform, get the people some very good information. Do y'all want to take questions from the chat, or y'all want to call it a day?
Listen, not even a little bit. No. Listen, I see something.
Leandre, real quick. Why do you have on a wave cap?
Because everybody on here is black. Why wouldn't I have on a wave cap?
I mean, you got braids, man. Like what the hell that? Like,
you know how it is in the hood. If your braids is messy, you put a wave cap on. Come on, P.
Okay. I just wanted to acknowledge that you was covering up your usually immaculate Afro puff / braids. Okay, cool. Afro braids. But that's fine. Okay, so if we're gonna call it a wrap, I'm gonna let each of y'all close it out. Take all the time you want. Tell the people where to find you, what you got going on, etc. And we'll call it a day. I'm gonna do a after show. Go to the Paradigm Shift TV 314 community page to vote for who you think won this debate, and that's how we're gonna do that. We'll start with our brother, Garfield the Great, the leader of the Dagger Squad, the host of the Brother Garfield podcast, published author, and certified great guy. Go ahead, Garfield.
Yeah, I wanna say, Leandre, thanks for doing this debate, and we need to do more dialogues like this. And I mean, Abraham being real don't make a difference to me, but I think I didn't see anything that you presented, and I'm being honest. I understand what you're doing. I understand where you're going. Matter of fact, the first slide that I showed, you actually have the same arguments that guy has. And I'll say this, with all of that, suppositions of this happening or nomadic people did this, it is a very hard task to prove that Abraham existed. I don't even think it's possible somebody could actually prove it based on what we have now. Maybe with the Elamite find that they have in archaeology, maybe now with that being deciphered, you might find evidence of those kings coming down to the Levant area, and that could possibly be proof of some sort of connection or truth to Genesis and all that stuff. But that's it for me. Peace.
All right. Once again, thank you to Brother Garfield for leaving his huge YouTube platform to come over to my small neck of the woods. I appreciate it, bro. My brother, Leandre, the Slim Reaper, award-winning scholar, taking time out his studies to come and bless the platform. Close out.
Yeah, so I think one of the greatest things that we saw here today is there's an actual debate methodology. I know I was accused of making up my own rules. I did not. Anyone who's done actual debate knows that the position that you're taking is you're advancing evidence for that particular position. So I needed to advance evidence showing that Abraham existed using a consistent historical methodology, and that's one of the things that I did. Contrary to what Garfield said, I didn't have the same arguments as a person on the screen, but I did use some of his sources like A.R. Millard, mostly because I watched Garfield's presentation before. So I very carefully selected my sources. But we did not see any argument advanced whatsoever for the position that Abraham did not exist, which actually was Garfield's burden. According to the actual rules of an actual debate, Garfield's burden was to show evidence that Abraham did not exist. And we got absolutely none of that. We heard about how things said about Abraham's story don't match up. We've heard about anachronisms, which could certainly be credited to later updating of the text for a myriad of reasons. Again, like I said, I might say that, that there was a gold rush in San Francisco. The place was not called San Francisco at the time, but that is an anachronism. Nonetheless, the events that took place did take place there. So we have an entire team named after the San Francisco 49ers. So again, evidence of anachronism is not evidence that such a thing did not happen. Numerous scholars like Tremper Longman in a book on how to read Genesis has already highlighted these issues. So again, the bottom line is that there is evidence that Abraham existed. Do not be biased against an actual historical source in the way that you would not be for any other culture. When reading anything from ancient Greek history, we are going to be recounting ancient texts from peoples who were friendly and in opposition to a particular text. You don't find many neutral text people doing history because that wasn't 21st century historical format. You actually wrote from a particular position with all of the stuff. And so that doesn't make a source non-historical. I didn't even go into various other things, which I won't mention now because it would be improper, but there was so much more that I could have went into. But on the whole, the biblical text is something that can be used to check for historical veracity. You can read the text of Scripture as literature and still walk away with evidence for Abraham's existence. And so, what we need to do is employ a consistent methodology, like we would examining Greek history, ancient Kemetic history, ancient Roman history, so on and so forth. And when we talk about figures that existed in proto-history or prehistory, as some other people call it, we recognize we're going to be dealing with scant sources, but that we can still say some things positively about figures who lived and existed, and appealing to bias is not evidence that the people didn't exist. Thank you all for your time and watching. Thank you to Low Down Dirty Shame for letting me on this channel. The brother took out the time and he let me on here. And so anyway, I appreciate you, P. I appreciate you, Brother Garfield, for the respectful dialogue.
No doubt. Hey, Dre, let me